Greetings. Today we get to talk about cash. Hooray for cash. Now, in at least most parts of the world, the term cash is much broader than the term currency. I notice as I travel around, when I talk about debiting cash and crediting sales or something like that, everyone gets disturbed because they think we want to debit the bank account. Well, the concept of cash, at least in the language I'm used to, cash would include bank accounts. And so we're starting off, I'm looking at page 164 of the accounting manual, the cash chapter. And remember, what we're covering here, we're not covering this entire chapter, we're covering financial reporting requirements of this chapter. So in this chapter, there's an example of how to take care of petty cash and managing cash inflows and internal control over cash disbursements and cash management and agency fund. But the only points that we'll cover in this video, at least, is the financial reporting requirements. So let's get started. First off, let's get a definition of what we mean by cash and cash equivalents. So forgive me for reading this to you. Cash includes currency and coins, banks and checks and drafts and instruments that you may have in your cash receipts drawer, your cash register. So if someone has paid you by a check, that counts as cash and that sort of thing, a money order. Okay, but cash equivalents also includes balances and checking and savings accounts and deposits at financial institutions. And cash equivalents is a way to talk about whether bank accounts are investments or whether they are cash. If they're cash, meet the requirement of a cash equivalent, then a bank accounts at the bank would be cash equivalents. If they don't, they're investments. Okay, and so cash equivalents are short-term, highly liquid investments that are readily convertible to known amounts of cash. So most of your checking accounts and bank accounts would meet that requirement if they're readily convertible to known amounts of cash. The bank is closed or is in trouble and you can't get the money out, it's a blocked, somehow the amount you can withdraw from the bank is limited, then they would not be a cash equivalent. Okay, only investments that have a maturity of 3 months or less at the date of acquisition meet this definition. This was a particular clause that caused me a little bit of trouble when I first heard it, but it is true and good gap. So if you put money into a certificate of deposit and you can get it out in a month, it's a cash equivalent, or 2 months. But if you can't get it out for 6 months when you put it in, then it's an investment, okay, that have a maturity of 3 months or less. So you have two hurdles that you're jumping over. Is the investment a current investment or a long-term investment, or is it in the investment a cash equivalent? So it's much more rigorous to meet the cash equivalent. You have to know how much you will get, and it has to be when you made the investment, the maturity is less than 3 months. Okay, so if the investment does not meet that definition, then it's an investment and is not a cash equivalent. Also, this is very important for our purposes, also cash and cash equivalents do not include accounts that are designated for non-operating purposes. Well, that's a very clear statement, but is designated for the purchase of non-current assets or for payment of long-term debt. So if you have set aside cash and its purpose, set aside by the board or set aside by a restriction of some sort of mortgage or a restricted donation, and it is set aside for non-operating purposes, for the purchase of non-current assets or for the payment of long-term debt. So if you have a cash account in the plant fund, it is an investment, not a cash equivalent. If you have a cash account in the operating fund, but the purpose of it is a restricted donation to one of these three things: non-operating purpose, to purchase a non-current asset or long-term debt, then it is not a cash equivalent. Okay, and to be precise, it is if it's set aside for a non-current asset, then it would be a non-current investment. Okay, so not only is it not a current cash equivalent, it is not a current assets investment, it is a non-current investment. So that is a tough thing for a lot of people to swallow. Okay, that any restricted donation for non-operating purposes of non-current assets, even if it's sitting in a cash account where you can draw it out right away, if it's for any of these three reasons: non-operating purpose, for purpose of purchasing a non-current assets, or payment of long-term debt, it might be sitting in a cash account at the bank, but that is a non-current investment. Okay? Also, if the board has said it wants to set aside money, okay, even if it's entitled to be a cash or cash equivalent, the board can say this money has been designated for non-current purposes. Okay, so it can take an action, establishes a policy which indicates which highly liquid investments qualified to be treated as cash. So it is possible for the board to take a cash account at the bank and designate that it is not available for current purposes. Okay, and so all this must be disclosed, explaining what the purpose of that money is. So if the bank may be saving it, the board may be saving it up for another purpose and paying its bills with, it can reclassify it out of cash. Okay, so hope that's clear. The main big news here is that cash in the plant fund is not cash. It is a long-term investment. Okay. The next big news under cash is down here. Down to is this appendix right here, Appendix 9A. It has a very important rule in it. It's about financial reporting, and so let's read it to you. Let me read it to you. Operating cash versus agency cash. Okay, this is news to a lot of people. Cash and cash equivalents are defined by the denomination as only the portion of cash that is available for operating purposes. Okay, so if it is not available for operating purposes, it's not cash and cash equivalents. We've actually already covered this. Cash equivalents should not include unrestricted cash necessary to offset agency liabilities, okay, our fiduciary obligations. And so by agency liabilities, we'll cover this later on. No, by agency liabilities, we mean very specifically those agency funds. So the offerings that you've collected that must be passed up to the higher organization, that's agency liability, or money you hold in trust for some other organization or by a potential donor. All of that is all agency liabilities, and so you must remove from your cash line, okay, from your cash line on the financial statements, must not include any money that would be necessary for the agency liability. And so these examples that we're going to go through here illustrate several scenarios that show you the possibilities of what you would encounter. Okay, very excellently done illustration here. Okay, let's get down to this. Let's look at, let's see if I can get this centered for us. Example 1. Okay, we'll focus on example 1 right now. This organization has $500 of cash sitting in petty cash, 5,000 in a bank account 1 and 6,000 in bank account 2. And then it has another bank account called two more bank accounts called agency specific bank account. That is any money that is received in an agency type fund, any trust funds they receive, any offerings from the churches are put into this bank account. Okay, this is a separate bank account from their operating bank accounts. Okay, and it is kept equal to the total agency liability. So whatever the liability is, it's in a specific bank account. Remember, this is example 1. It's an example way of doing it. There's no rule that says that you must keep it in an agency specific bank account. Some places feel that's important and some places don't. But in any case, and then there's another bank account in play here. The plant fund bank account has 15,000. Now we can dispatch with the plant fund bank account right away. So the plant fund in all of our examples has 15,000, and all those 15,000 all go down in non-current assets. Okay, so we don't need to talk about it in the other examples. Okay, the plant fund bank account, no matter if it's a cash account that can be gotten to right away, it goes down into non-current assets. So let's go back to the agency fund. In this case, we have an agency specific bank account of $33,500, and the agency liability is $33,500. And so the display in the financial statements of current assets would put $11,500, the amount in the regular bank accounts, in cash, and then they would be cash held for agency has the other 33,000. It has 33,500. To put it very simply, as you go through all of these examples, the amount held for agency equals, if you've got the money, the cash held for agency equals the agency fund. Okay, so in this case, they have put it in a separate bank account. That separate bank account is shown here as cash held for agency, and it equals the amount of the liability. And this example number 2, they do not have an agency specific bank account. All the money is kept in other bank accounts. All the money of the organization is in other bank accounts. And so it will take the amount held, so the agency liability is $33,500, and so look here what happens. Very interesting. Cash is $4,000 and cash held for agency is $33,500. So any of this cash up here up to the amount that the liability is shown as cash held for agency, and any above that is showed cash for operations. So you can see cash held for agency equals the agency liability there. Okay, so I think this is the scenario of most organizations, is that we have the agency liability, whatever cash it would take to cover that is shown on our balance sheet, statement of financial position, as cash held for agency, and is not shown cash for operations. Only the amount of cash that we have that is above the cash held for agency is shown as cash. Okay? In example 3, we have $33,500 in cash. Excuse me, we have $27,500 in cash, and our agency liability is $33,500. Okay, so we do not have enough to cover. Okay, and so all of the cash that we have is shown in cash held for agency. We have no operating cash. So let's reiterate that to make sure that we're clear, is that our total cash is $27,500 and our agency liability $33,500. So all the cash that we do have is shown as agency cash. Okay, so we would not put $33,500 in cash here and a negative number in cash held for operating. That's example 3. Okay, I hope that you're not in that situation. I hope most of you are in example 2. Example 4 is that we have $7,000 in cash, okay, and we have agency liability of $33,500. Okay, but we do have a agency specific bank account, and so we would take $32,000. Okay, that would be all the cash that we have, both specified and non-specified, is being shown in cash held for agency. Still not adequate to cover our agency liability, but any cash that we have, we say, is designated for agency, whether it has been put in a separate account or not. Okay, in this third example, we have $14,500 deficit in our cash. We have an agency specific bank account of $17,500. Well, this $17,500 would go cash held for agency, and the $14,500 overdraft is shown as a liability. This is a good time to mention that anytime you have cash and cash equivalents in the negative range, it is not a cash or cash equivalent negative. It is a liability and needs to be shown down in the liability section. Okay, so you would never have a bracketed number under cash held for operating. It is a liability. And the automatic financial statements that we do in SunPlus do not provide for that right now. So if you ever had a negative showing in cash, you would have to export the financial statements out to Excel and move the negative figure in cash down to liabilities. Remember, you cannot just simply take SunPlus financial statements and run them and think that they're covering all the possible iterations of what can be encountered in your organization. In general, it's right in most situations, but the financial statements, the automatic financial statements, do not cover every possible combination. Okay, for example, the current financial statements, the latest financial statements coming out of SunPlus, take whatever you have in cash, like basically do example 2, which we feel is what most organizations have, where they have more cash, and whatever cash they have, whatever liability they have in agency, that amount of cash is set aside and the remainder is set up here. But if you're in any of these other scenarios, you'll have to export it to Excel and fix the misstatement and the statements. So the financial statements try to cover most of the circumstances we encounter, but they do not cover all. Your responsibility is to issue financial statements that represent your organization, not just whatever happens to print out of SunPlus. So that's our end of presentation in cash. We can run through the summary of a few of the high points. The first is that cash equivalents and cash equivalents would not cover any cash, not include any cash for investments that mature over 3 months, longer than 3 months away. It would not include any cash that is designated for the planned fund or for non-operating purposes or for a repayment of debt, and it would not include a cash that should be set aside for the agency's specific responsibilities, so that the money that you've collected from the churches and pass on, that agency responsibility, that cash is not in your operating cash held for operating, but in a separate line under current assets. So thank you for your time, and we will move on now and talk about accounts receivable.